This plant was called dangerous by the FDA. It was pulled from shelves. It disappeared from stores overnight. And you know what it does in the garden? It creates infinite fertilizer, for free, forever. I want you to think about that for a second. Not as a gardening tip, as a question. If a plant exists that pulls nutrients from 3 meters underground, grows back every 4 weeks no matter how many times you cut it, and turns into rich fertilizer within 48 hours of hitting the soil, why don't you already know about it? Why isn't it in every garden? Why isn't it taught in every agricultural school? Why did it vanish so completely that most people watching this right now are hearing the name for the very first time? The answer isn't complicated, but it is uncomfortable, and this channel exists precisely for moments like this one. What I'm about to show you isn't a theory. It isn't a conspiracy. It's a documented timeline, field trials, regulatory records, economic incentives that tells a very specific story about how useful things disappear, not because they stop working, but because the systems built around them stop having any reason to keep them visible. That distinction matters. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why. This is Comfrey, specifically a sterile hybrid called Bocking 14, developed in rural England in the 1960s by a man who gave his discovery away for free, validated by decades of field trials that were never refuted, and then quietly buried after a regulatory decision that had nothing to do with how this plant is actually used in the garden. I'm not going to ask you to trust me. I'm going to walk you through what happened, step by step. The documents exist. The numbers exist. The timeline exists. And at the end of this video, I'm going to ask you one question. Who decided you didn't need to know? And whether the answer to that changes anything about how you grow food or how much you trust the systems that decide what knowledge reaches you, that part is entirely up to you. In 2001, the FDA, the most powerful regulatory body in the world, issued a formal restriction against Comfrey. Supplements made from the plant were banned. The name vanished from health food stores. And along with it, vanished decades of accumulated knowledge about what this plant actually does in the soil. Now, here's the part nobody talks about. The restriction was for human ingestion. Compounds called pyrrolizidine alkaloids present in the leaves can damage the liver when consumed in high doses over long periods of time. That part is real. That part is not a myth. But Comfrey placed on garden soil doesn't go near your liver. It goes into the roots of your plants. That is an obvious scientific distinction, one that any horticulturalist could have made in 30 seconds. And yet, the reputation of the entire plant was destroyed without that distinction ever being clearly communicated to the public. Think about what that means in practice. A gardener in 2002 walks into their local nursery asking for Comfrey. The person behind the counter doesn't know the restriction applies only to dietary supplements. They just know the word banned appeared next to the plant's name on the evening news. So they say no. The gardener goes home, finds alarming headlines online, and never thinks about Comfrey again. That's how knowledge dies, not in a courtroom, in a 30-second conversation at a nursery counter that nobody questioned. At the time of the restriction, there were 0 documented cases of liver damage from Comfrey used as garden mulch or liquid fertilizer. 0. The science was legitimate within its own narrow context, but that context was never communicated clearly. And in the absence of nuance, fear fills the gap. Gardeners who had used Comfrey for decades went quiet. Nurseries stopped stocking it. A technique validated by British researchers for over 30 years was buried alongside the fear, not because garden use had failed, but because the supplement market had created a liability no one wanted near their name. When fear travels faster than nuance, and it always does, what gets lost isn't just a plant. It's an entire body of knowledge that took decades to build and less than a news cycle to erase. Once the word banned attaches to a name, distinctions stop being made, and the people who knew better find themselves with no platform to correct the record. To understand why that erasure was so complete, you need to go back much further than 2001. To understand what was lost, you need to go back to 1954. Europe was crawling out of the wreckage of World War II, exhausted soils, food scarcity. In Britain, rationing had only ended that same year, 9 years after the war itself. People weren't philosophically interested in organic farming. They were desperate for anything that worked on damaged land with almost no money. It was in that context that Lawrence D. Hills, a British horticulturalist with no funding and no institutional backing, founded the Henry Doubleday Research Association in a modest house in Bocking, Essex. Hills wasn't an academic, he was an observer, and he had noticed something the agronomists of his era were ignoring. Wild comfrey was growing in terrible soils, and the ground beneath it was measurably different, darker, richer, more alive. Nobody was studying this. It existed only as folk knowledge, the kind that doesn't get funded, doesn't get published, and eventually gets forgotten when the generation that carried it dies. But wild comfrey had a serious problem. It was invasive. A single broken root fragment left in the soil could regenerate into a full plant. No practical farmer would cultivate something that behaved like that. So Hills spent years crossing varieties, testing, recording. In 1958, he began formal trials with 21 different varieties. By the mid-1960s, one had separated itself from all the others. Bocking 14. Sterile, high-yield, disease-resistant, with the highest potassium levels he had ever recorded. It stayed where you put it. It came back stronger every time it was cut. Hills didn't patent it. He gave it away, cuttings sent through the post to anyone who wrote asking. Meanwhile, the agricultural world moved in the opposite direction. After the war, munitions factories became nitrogen fertilizer plants. Governments backed synthetic inputs as the foundation of post-war food security. Universities built curricula around it. The story that emerged was simple. Modern chemistry had solved the fertility problem. Everything else was old thinking. Against that backdrop, a man in Essex giving away free cuttings never stood a chance. Industrial agriculture didn't win because it was better for the soil. It won because it was better for the balance sheet of everyone selling inputs. And in that world, a plant you grow once and harvest for free indefinitely wasn't just inconvenient. It was structurally incompatible with everything being built around it. So what does Bocking 14 actually do? Let's get specific, because the mechanism is what makes this plant genuinely difficult to dismiss. The root goes 2 to 3 meters deep. While most vegetables stay in the top 30 centimeters of soil, comfrey mines layers no other common garden plant can reach. Potassium, calcium, phosphorus, nitrogen, locked in deep strata, inaccessible to shallow-rooted crops. Comfrey pulls those minerals up and concentrates them in its leaves. It functions, in the most literal biological sense, as a mineral pump, drawing resources from a depth your vegetables will never reach. Then the mechanism begins. You cut the leaves to the ground. 4 times per season. You wait 4 weeks. The plant regrows stronger than before. The cut leaves go directly around other plants. Tomatoes, squash, strawberries, fruit trees, whatever you're growing. Within 48 hours, the leaves are gone. No complicated preparation. They simply disappear into the soil. The reason is the plant's unusually low carbon to nitrogen ratio. While straw or wood chips take weeks to break down, comfrey liquefies rapidly, releasing its minerals almost immediately into the soil food web. The numbers are striking. Fresh comfrey leaves contain up to 7% potassium by dry weight. Typical cattle manure sits between 0.5% and 1%. Blood meal, one of the most concentrated organic nitrogen sources available, contains almost no potassium at all. Comfrey delivers a broad, nutrient-dense, fast-release input that costs nothing after establishment. You are not looking at a minor improvement. You are looking at a categorically different level of fertility input. There's a second application, comfrey tea. Fill a container with cut leaves, cover with water, wait 3 to 4 weeks. The fermentation produces a dark, concentrated liquid you dilute and apply directly to the soil. The smell is significant, not a process for an open window. But the result rivals commercial liquid fertilizers at a cost of 0. An established plant doesn't need to be replanted. Bocking 14 produces no viable seeds. It stays exactly where you put it. Over 20 years, a single bed transforms the soil around it. Deep roots fracture compacted layers. Organic matter builds structure season after season. You plant it once, and it operates indefinitely, which is either the most compelling argument for growing it, or, depending on your perspective, exactly the problem with it. So why have most people never heard of Bocking 14? Let's ask the question more directly. who benefited from Comfrey disappearing from mainstream agricultural culture. Start with the regulatory context. The FDA restriction in 2001 was based on toxicity studies. Rats consuming concentrated pyrrolizidine alkaloid extracts at doses equivalent to pounds of raw leaves per day. It was not a study about garden use. It was specifically about dietary supplements. The science was real and the concern legitimate. But one federal restriction with a plant's name on it is enough for the entire market to retreat. Nurseries stop stocking, retailers pull it from catalogs, and the critical nuance that ingested extracts and soil-applied decomposing leaves are categorically different never made it into the headline, because nuance doesn't travel as fast as the word ban. This is not a unique pattern. A legitimate safety concern in one context gets applied, without examination, to every other context associated with the same name. Labels stick, and markets respond to labels, not to the underlying science. Then there's the economic structure, and this requires no malice and no coordination. Comfrey generates no recurring revenue. You buy one cutting once, or get a division free from a neighbor. No subscription model, no annual repurchase, no branded bag, no retail margin. Industrial fertilizers operate on an entirely different model. A global market worth hundreds of billions per year in which every harvest creates a new purchase event. The business model of synthetic fertilizer depends on the farmer returning to buy inputs every season. A plant that eliminates that dependency isn't just an alternative, it's a structural threat to the model itself. I'm not saying anyone decided to eliminate Comfrey. Economic systems passively eliminate anything that cannot be monetized. No executive sent a memo. The market simply stopped having any incentive to talk about it, and in a world where what gets talked about determines what gets known, silence functions exactly like a ban. Hills died in 1990 without seeing his discovery reach scale. The organization he founded still exists, now called Garden Organic, but Comfrey never returned to the center of the conversation. The data still exists. The field trials were never retracted. Everything Hills built is still there, unchanged and unrefuted. The only thing missing is the incentive to talk about it loudly enough for it to matter. Here's what the science actually says today, and I want to be careful, because this channel doesn't deal in false certainty. Hills field trial data from the 1960s and 70s has never been scientifically refuted. The productivity figures, up to 100 tons of biomass per acre per year, were recorded in real field conditions, not in controlled laboratory settings. The rapid decomposition of the leaves has been confirmed through independent soil analysis. The potassium content is documented consistently across multiple analyses in different countries and decades. The composting accelerator effect is verifiable by anyone with a thermometer and a compost heap. These are documented, reproducible observations recorded by independent researchers across decades. What does not exist is something equally important. Large-scale, peer-reviewed comparative studies on Comfrey versus synthetic fertilizers under controlled modern conditions. That study has never been conducted. Hundreds of millions of research dollars flow annually into marginal improvements on synthetic fertilizer formulations. The question of whether a freely propagating perennial plant can match those formulations has never received serious institutional attention, not because the question isn't interesting, but because there is no stakeholder with a financial interest in funding that answer. Research follows money, and money follows return. So we are left with a genuinely strange gap. Decades of careful empirical evidence from patient gardeners and smallholders who measured and recorded without institutional support, and near total silence in the mainstream scientific literature. That gap doesn't prove anything. Informal observation doesn't replace controlled methodology. Confirmation bias is real. People who invest in a practice tend to report that it works, and that has to be factored into how we read the evidence. But the absence of a formal study is not evidence of failure. We don't know that Comfrey underperforms synthetic fertilizers, because that comparison has never been made under rigorous conditions. The silence in the scientific record is not a verdict. It is a gap created by the absence of financial interest. The cause is not scientific doubt. It is the complete absence of anyone with enough money and motivation to resolve the uncertainty. That distinction matters both for how we evaluate this plant and for how we think about which agricultural questions ever get answered at all. Comfrey is a plant, but what happened to it is a pattern. and recognizing the pattern is more important than any single plant. Methods that don't fit a supply chain, that don't create dependency, that don't generate recurring revenue, they don't get formally banned. What happens instead is quieter and more effective. They just stop being taught. They stop appearing in search results. They stop showing up in agricultural curricula. They stop being stocked on nursery shelves. And slowly, without anyone making a single deliberate decision, they disappear from the conversation entirely. The knowledge doesn't get destroyed. It gets deprioritized until it becomes invisible. The people who kept this knowledge alive weren't researchers with grants. They were gardeners and smallholders who shared what they learned through newsletters, word of mouth, and internet forums that most people never found. They preserved something institutions had no incentive to preserve. The fact that you're watching a video about this now, decades after it should have been common knowledge, says something important about how fragile useful information is when it has no commercial protector and no revenue model attached to it. Over the coming weeks, I'm going to keep investigating these methods, techniques labeled pseudoscience, outdated, unproven, with decades of documented use before they vanished from mainstream awareness. Some will turn out to be genuinely flawed, and I'll tell you that clearly when they are. Some will turn out to be exactly what they claim to be. The process of telling those two categories apart, honestly, without an agenda, following the evidence wherever it leads, is the work this channel exists to do. Not to confirm what you already believe, not to give you a villain, but to close the gap between what is known and what is talked about. Because the question isn't just, does this work? The question is, who decided you didn't need to know, and what would change if that knowledge came back? If those questions matter to you, you already know what to do.